many analysts that have written on this are thinking more it's going to be about $1 trillion, not 1.9. This was the starting point. What's going to get the job done?
Thank you so much for having me. And I think that those analysts are underestimating what Biden's going to get. I mean, in terms of ideal design, most of what's in this package is actually very useful. The state and local government aid, particularly the money going to vaccines, money going to education, the extension of the unemployment benefit top-ups. The part that's somewhat more dubious in terms of necessity is the topping up to $2,000 per person below a certain income threshold. That's not as necessary and as useful. But that's going to be the most politically sticky part. They might constrain more the upper bound on what income you have before you're cut out from that, which would be fine. But I think it's going to come closer to 1.2, 1.3, maybe even 1.4 trillion. And let's not forget that when we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars, those are significant differences.
Mm-hmm.
Adam, on the screen right now, we're calling it 1.9 trillion in stimulus. This isn't stimulus, this is relief. The stimulus may come further down the road. In a month's time, we're going to get an unveiling of the infrastructure program that's going to be delivered. How big does the stimulus need to be? The IMF's managing director urging the US to go big.
Well, and we've seen people, including former Republican official Glenn Hubbard, I think the Wall Street Journal today, saying go big. And this is big, okay? You combine this with what was passed in December and what was passed in the spring, and we're talking an enormous share of GDP. And as terrible as things are in human terms, the economy has recovered a lot. So yes, you're absolutely right, guys. I mean, this is relief. This is going to make a material difference to human well-being, and in particular to the spread and management of the pandemic. And so again, you were mentioning before the break, the vaccine setbacks. Assuming that the vaccine does get properly distributed before things mutate in a way the vaccines can't handle, this is going to be a big help to the economy. In terms of what's coming down the pike, I think that is going to be more about structural change. Is there a sustained green budget? Is there a change in the tax code? And so talking about the next package of stimulus, I think maybe the label, but is somewhat misleading.
So, and that was interesting in that Biden tied vaccine to COVID relief. So now he's kind of made the link between the two, which could also help. Does this further the idea that the U.S. can stay exceptional? Because that idea was sort of trashed in 2020. And the idea about a few months ago was that Europe was going to pick up that helm. But Europe dealing with the virus is a mess. Does the U.S. now get another leg up?
It's a really profound point, that the U.S. has done huge damage to its standing in markets, its standing internationally, for real reasons. And I think the relative race with Europe will, the U.S., as you put it, will get a leg up, because the fact is that the Biden administration, simply by putting resources in, being science-based, being more competent about the vaccine distribution, will get ahead of what Trump did and also what some European governments are doing. But is it a lasting thing, especially since we know come the 2022 election or the 2024 election, some of this could be reversed? That I'm not so sure. So I don't think you get a lasting leg up of the U.S. versus Europe right now.
We're talking about fiscal policy. Let's have a quick beat on monetary policy. Powell yesterday seemed to tie off for the time being the idea that there's going to be a taper. When it does become appropriate, he said, for the committee to discuss specific dates, we will let the world know. We will communicate very clearly to the public, and we'll do so in a way well in advance of active consideration of being basically a gradual run through the taper of the asset purchases. Let's just talk a little bit about kind of where you think the Fed is and where you think the Fed is going. There seems to have been a division within the Fed about whether or not we need to be talking about tapering. As I say, Powell, to a certain extent, tied that off yesterday. When do you think it comes, though? If we are going to see the US economy bouncing back in the second half of this year, if yields are going to continue to rise, and we've seen some data out today suggest that the consumer thinks that within a year's time we're going to see inflation running at 3%, when do you think that moment arrives?
I think we're overcomplicating this because Powell and Vice Chair Richard Clarida earlier in the week have been very clear that they intend to overshoot on inflation. And so, yes, you're going to start hearing various Reserve Bank presidents, maybe even members of the Board of Governors, though certainly not Will Brainerd, who's the most important other member of the board for this purpose, are going to mouth off. And to the degree they're going to have any traction for tapering, it's going to be talking about financial stability risks, not about inflation. And even then, I don't think they're going to get much traction. I think that there's going to be plenty of noise, but in the end, the Fed is not going to taper anything until we've got some sustained inflation. I mean, Clarida said, and Powell basically said, it's got to be over 2% for a year. Now, I don't think we necessarily hold them to that. And there's some question, do they hold their nerve if markets start freaking out a bit and the 10-year starts going up? But bottom line, I don't expect them to do any tapering until nearly 2 years from now, until fourth quarter of 2022 at the earliest. And I think that there will be a lot of uncertainty legitimately, and therefore a lot of space for the Fed to say, how much inflation are we seeing is a temporary response to pent-up demand rather than an ongoing inflation issue? How much are wage growth being affected by low end of the income distribution coming back into the workforce? So I think I would take the oversight. It's going to take a lot longer for the Fed to taper or raise rates than people seem to be worrying.
Well, and that really brings us back to Guy's question about the actual stimulus when it comes, because it all depends on what fiscal multiplier we see and if we do see a strong CapEx cycle out of it. And then that really depends on what projects and what things get passed in a real stimulus bill. What do you think is ready to be pulled the trigger on that can meaningfully move us to that scenario?
I think you put it very well. It's at this point, the size is big, and then the question becomes the composition and how much it's sustained. And so I think you're going to be having a headwind that almost certainly the actual budget that comes out after this America Recovers, whatever they're calling it, package, will be passed probably through reconciliation, and therefore will include tax increases on capital gains, on business, on corporate tax rate, potentially on a little bit on some individuals. And so that'll be a headwind, although I think it shouldn't be exaggerated. You are also going to have how much green do you go, and where does the money get allocated for how long? And I think that's still to play for, to be honest.
Can I just come back to this issue of whether or not the US has the potential to deliver all of this better than Europe? And I'm really interested in this Europe versus US comparison at the moment. Much was made of, as Alex says, Europe's kind of Hamiltonian moment and the Next Generation Fund and the fact that this is going to be spent on a green revolution in Europe. When it actually comes down to it, countries like Italy have a really poor record of spending large amounts of money. In fact, the Italian government is potentially about to fall apart over this very issue. Do you think the US has a greater capacity, a greater bureaucratic capacity to spend money do you think the United States has a better capacity than Europe?
It's a really important question. And as you say, the reality is hitting in the Italian political system, where they were hoping for a stable government, and over this issue of how responsibly they're going to spend what money they get from Europe is breaking them. And I think the answer, unfortunately, still lies with Macron and Merkel, or Merkel's successor, because it is a question of how much the central, maybe not Hamiltonian, but definite leap forward in central fiscal capacity in Europe gets dispersed and gets used. And we're starting to see the noises from the German finance ministry that maybe there's not going to be any more stimulus, and maybe they're going to hold off. And then that has a trickle-down effect politically and financially on the rest of Europe. So I think the U.S. will potentially outshine Europe in terms of response over the next year or two. But again, I want to come back to 2 points. First, even if Europe falls behind here, it's still in a fundamentally better place, and the divergences are smaller than they would have been without the step forward in European capacity that we've seen. So on a relative basis, Europe's downside is less. And second, in the US, unless we get some very fundamental political reforms, the ability of whatever good things the Biden administration and the current Congress do, or the incoming Congress, I should say, do, it may not last. And the Trump administration and the previous Congress certainly put us behind it.